thanks so much to Professor David Simon for inviting me. We met in Stockholm at the development conference in August, and it was only then that I learnt about the Mistra Urban Futures project. But I came to Sweden on my research leave to make some new connections, and so I'm very grateful for this chance today to see your premises, learn more about your project, and also to speak to an audience who've come because they are in some way intrigued about what's happening in the Pacific. I'm just concerned whether people on the side can see okay. Is it all right? Okay, because I've got the laptop over there, so I'll be going over there to hit the button. So what I'm going to do is I'll tell you briefly about myself, just because I'm new here, and then I'll introduce this topic of Pacific Islands and get into this question of capacity to engage with the SDGs. And I'll give you my conclusions very early on so that then I can relax and not have to rush through to get to the end if we don't make it that far. So let's begin. I've learned to give the conclusions at the beginning and then I can relax. Now, you know, the Pacific is this excellent book, the Routledge Handbook on Cities of the Global South. I came partly because I've been travelling in the Pacific for 30 years, and there's a lot of scholarship and literature in the Pacific, a lot of activity, a lot of development activity, but it never makes it into these books. And I'm curious about that. The Routledge Handbook on Cities of the Global South, but there's no Pacific content, there's no Pacific cities, there's no Pacific urban questions. And so I came looking for, well, what are the comparative points and why is it? I gave one seminar at the School of Global Studies just looking at the omissions from so-called global projects. And to my way of thinking, if a project says it's global, it will have something from each part of the world. I'm not saying it has to have every part of the world, but if it's global, it would look at the experience of all the different regions. So that's the perspective in which I come to Europe to look at the, how does Europe conceive of the Pacific in global policy issues, which the SDGs are. So that's part of the motivation for coming and meeting you. Now, what I'm going to do, as I said, I'll talk briefly about myself, and I'll try to introduce local government of the Pacific Islands. It's only a snapshot today. It's a short session, and so I won't cover everything. It's to my frustration that I can't share more with you, but I have to be disciplined. SDG 11 and then discussion. So that's what we're going to do. Now, as David said, I'm at Victoria University, previously in Melbourne, Papua New Guinea, a place called Landig in Switzerland, and the University of South Pacific. A couple of current projects. I've just while I'm here, I've been drafting an outline for a book on government and public policy in the Pacific Islands. That's my major project at the moment. We've just handed in an edited book on EGovernment in the Pacific Islands, which will be a first on that, and it's going to be published by spring. And the idea is to get Pacific into global series rather than just publishing back in the Pacific. I've just one of the things that took me away on these quick trips was a chapter called Political Governance for Human Development, which the Common Secretariat will publish very shortly. At the same time, I'm academic director for Papua New Guinea's diplomacy training program, which keeps me up late at night because I organise, and I'll show you a couple of pictures of that. But that also gets me deeply engaged with young people and also with bureaucracy in Papua New Guinea. I'm part of the New Zealand Centre for Global Studies. I link the local to the global, and we have a small active group that are looking at bringing more global studies to New Zealand, because there's not much actual discussion of what do we mean by global studies. Some people know about globalization, but how do you study it? So we've got a journal at our university called Policy Quarterly, and we're working on some articles there. I've been heavily involved in the United Nations Association in New Zealand. I didn't mean to, but ended up being president for 4 years and did a lot of projects on the UN, but partly because of my exposure to the UN agencies in different parts of the world, and launching a little project on New Zealand and the Security Council because we're finishing a 2-year term there. And New Zealand went into the Security Council saying it was the champion of small states, so we're going to ask what they did for small states. And the last one I mentioned here, I'm going to do more online seminars, Pacific Islands Public Sector Dialogue Series. I'm working with the Commonwealth Local Government Forum to conceive of a project next year where we go online. And the whole idea is that, you know, if you're interested from here, the only thing is that it'll probably be in the middle of the night, but apart from that, with new technologies, we can actually engage with policymakers online if we have some substantive shared questions. So let's get to it. Now, the major book, I'm doing it in 4 parts. The Pacific region is life world. This is a Habermasian perspective with system and life world. And the life world has traditional leadership and living, chiefly systems in different ways. And this is how people have lived and still live at local level. And then you've got the system of government, which is like introduced through colonial period, decolonisation, but the modern system of government. So even I'm looking at, there's just come out just the last 3 days, Vanuatu's 2030, the People's Plan. And it's got the same sort of imagery as the SDGs. They've taken the imagery, the nice little coloured boxes. There's only black and white, but they're doing that. And typically in Pacific countries, one of the major goals will be accommodating traditional governance and modern governance, and it's really a key feature. And that's also part of local government studies in the region. So the life world, the system, and also looking at how local government is currently configured in the system. And then the interaction between system and life world is where the policy dialogue, or lack of policy dialogue. So the question of how you change your system, you change laws, policies, regulations, funding models, you need dialogue. And then you need an attitude toward dialogue. And if the attitude toward dialogue isn't there, you don't get the policy dialogue going. And you just get whatever models come out of those who hold power. So there's a huge area there of policy dialogue around local government in the Pacific. And obviously intergovernmental relations. What are the relationship between national levels of government, provincial and local? How is it financed? What are the responsibilities given at different levels, etc. And then the 4th part of the book, which is again the reason that I came to Europe, was to look at the Pacific region in the global era, the expansion of the life world, that we don't just live in villages anymore, we live in global villages, global cities and global nations. So the reason I'm moving on to leaving Gothenburg is I'm going to Brussels and Geneva to talk to the Pacific ambassadors there about how they, as the small representatives of small states, how do they navigate the global systems where they're always the smallest player in the room. And I'm going to ask them about that. So, and also, you see, when we get to this global dialogue, SDGs fit in there. How do they fit into that? So that's sort of the big picture of things. So I've already indicated my theoretic interests at the moment relying on Habermasian-inspired perspectives on a dialogue, and there's a great need to improve policy dialogue in my part of the world. And part of that is also improving access to knowledge, because knowledge exists, but it's not shared well, it's not stored well, it's not disseminated well. And this, in the area of the SDGs, it's all about knowledge creation, how are we doing, how can we do better, how do we do in previous times under what conditions. So that knowledge, sharing of experience, has got to be some sort of learning, then transition has to take place. Now here's my conclusions. And then I'll give you some pretty pictures and things. So the UN, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, puts out a world public policy report. They've only done about 4 or 5 of them since 2001. But they've just put one out, and it really goes in detail about what is responsive and accountable governance. In tremendous detail, a global report. Again, not too much consideration of specific examples. But when you talk about the challenge of government at local level, it's accountability and responsiveness. And I can give you many, many examples of where a local government exists, there is a budget, but there's no delivery of services. And if there are complaints, there's no responsiveness to those complaints. So you get this build-up of angst at local level in the Pacific that you haven't seen yet. But one day it'll be on the news and you'll say, oh, where did that come from? Well, it came from decades of frustration at not getting out of government what people want. So responsive accountable government, improved knowledge management practices about local government, because you can go in all the small Pacific countries and say, well, you know, where is your library? Where are your records? What about the people who held that office before you? So institutional memory. And one of the things we have challenged as academics, and we go into an agency and we say, well, I remember coming to this agency 15 years ago. You weren't here, but I was here. And now where's the knowledge of that time? But there's a new person, they say, well, I'm here now, and what I know is what the institution knows. So, and you're familiar with these things, but these are the challenges. I just have to give you in brief so that we can get into some more substance here. So improving policy dialogue and analysis. So the whole question of policy dialogue, who's responsible for dialogue about local government? Do you just leave it to a few NGOs that are involved in local government, or is it a whole of government concern? Because, and then in what ways is the whole of government interested in local issues? And I'm going to give you an example of how squatters in Fiji just completely fell through the cracks. They didn't fit into anybody's interest because they were outside the system. And all right, so now another part of that, big part of my message, is that local government is both rural and urban. And when we say local government, you mean urban development, cities and towns. Well, in some parts of the world, they've still got 50 to 70% of the population are living in villages. And I've been asking for too long now. When I go into these countries and I say to people, now what's your plan for the village of the future? Well, nobody's looking at that. We have rural services, but what's your vision? Where are you going? Because the village of the future has to have something that looks livable. Otherwise, I wouldn't want to live there. And if I wouldn't want to live there, why do I tell all these people you're going to enjoy staying in the village? So if you're going to have rural societies, and you can't urbanise everybody, so this question of vision is part of it. So it's a really important part of my findings here. Evidence-based policy analysis, transparency processes. Now, a lot of these things I don't have time to go into detail, but what I mean here is that Pacific, we often say it's a region full of plans and aspirations, and the minister will always be there launching a plan. But when you look for the implementation reports, is this something familiar? So I'm here to get encouragement that it's not just in this part of the world. So you can literally find a plan is launched, and you say, right, it was a 5-year plan. Now, are there any implementation reports? Well, maybe one or two, haphazard. Are there any evaluations at end of project? Can't find them. And when you can find them, you can only find them on the websites of the development partners who funded it. And what it actually means in the end is that in terms of knowledge of the small states, the development agencies have more knowledge than the countries themselves. So Asian Development Bank, certainly all the World Bank, has more detailed knowledge of the resources in the Pacific than the Pacific countries do. Well, okay, maybe that's just the way of the world. But this idea of countries being in command of who they are, what they possess, what their problems are. So this knowledge management and owning evaluation. Now, see, I learnt my lessons very small steps. So when I was in Fiji, a very busy life, 6 years running a governance program, and we'd be sitting in a policy dialogue with somebody who's come from the planning office, and we're so thrilled that he's there. So, okay, he's come and he's got a report in front of him. He said, well, I've got the midterm review of our development plan. And we said, oh, well, how's it going? He said, I can't tell you. And he literally had some lines crossed out, which is, the economic data and things. The very things that we need to learn from, he wasn't at liberty to tell in a forum for learning. And those experiences have, repeated over and over, have led me to my conclusions about what's needed. And the SDGs bring home all of these lessons. They have to be learnt. If they're not, we can end the session now and say it's not going to happen. So there needs to be some transformations. Okay, so that's only one side of the screen. Unfortunately, there's more. Law and policy. Law for local government to clarify the powers and responsibilities of local government, because when they're not in place, you get stamped on by national level or provincial level, you get duplication, etc. You get lots of political games going on, and that includes fiscal reform, tax reform, and that's linked to if you've got so many people they're outside of the tax system, they don't feel linked to government performance in any way. And Vanuatu's trying to cope with this at the moment. The government knows they need tax reform. They need to get people more engaged. And people say, we don't want to get anywhere near that sort of question. Very difficult questions. How are you going to fund? So you might get into a mindset that says, well, we're developing countries. We rely on international help. And we maximise that, and we're good at that. And I've had a Minister for Finance brag to me that of all the Pacific envelope, his country got the most. Because they studied it. They studied what was available from all the development agencies, said how can we maximise our catch from that? Rather than how can we maximise from our own development activities, etc. So a lot of lessons that I've learned. Capacity buildings are obviously a constant everywhere. All sorts of capacity building for local level effectiveness, so there's nothing new there, but also the involvement of science, technology and innovation at local level, local science, local technology. And I've found there's a divergence between local producers of scientific knowledge and policymakers. They don't talk to each other. So there are often solutions in country. You don't need to have foreign experts come in to do it. And so bringing these together, so there is a sort of a science policy dialogue. Now, see, I've got so many anecdotes in my head. I'll let this one out, and then I'll try to stick to the script. So there's a city called Nandi, which is in Fiji, and it floods every 1 or 2 or 3 years. Water rushes down. It's just an estuary near the sea, and the whole town gets flooded. And a friend of mine was a professor of environmental studies, and I said, well, how long have you known? He said, look, this city in 50 years' time, it's just going to be uninhabitable. I said, how long have you known this? He said, well, we've known this for 30 years. I said, well, why doesn't government move the city? He says, well, they don't listen to us. And so you've got this divergence between what scientific knowledge knows about the future of that city and what the habit and custom of the people say, well, we've always lived here. And we're not going to change. And so if you went online and looked at, you just Google for flooding Nandi, and you'll see shops and houses with water up to here every 2 or 3 years. And so the science. So that's some of the things. Now the one I would add one there is vision, the need for vision of the future of the Pacific City and the vision of this. Now, so that's my conclusions. Now, just a little bit of my background how I got there. A lot of activities with UNDP. In human security over the years, this sort of collaborative project that we do between the university and NGOs, and lots of now. I've got to not go off script, but so this Pao Lutero, he now is the Samoan ambassador. This is years ago when he's an academic. Now he's the ambassador in Brussels, and I'll see him in a week's time. Mm-hmm. So I'm thrilled to find out where some of these people are still engaged in development. Now this is a Commonwealth Pacific network of central government agencies. And so I try to connect both at national level and local level. And so this is a meeting last year. This is the Prime Minister of Samoa. And this lady's she's an African lady who came from Commonwealth in London, etc. And I'm, in this picture, I'm the only what's called Pakeha or Palangi, the only European there. And I take that as a sort of, just a sense of satisfaction that I'm sufficiently integrated into the network to be there. But everybody else is Pacific Islander. We had a tremendous, the report came out of the meeting, and the rapporteur said that Professor Hassal gave an unflattering report of the situation. I was just trying to be frank and honest and, in the spirit of sharing, but that's how the record put it. But it was accepted as a true thing. Okay, so there's part of the Foreign Service training. We have a cohort of 30 each time, young people, and we train in Port Moresby and in Wellington, and that's an example of a regional meeting that they would help to run the protocol and that sort of thing, and eventually they become the bigwigs in those sorts of regional meetings. This is in the classroom. This is just a few weeks ago, so that's why it's there. About roughly 30 students there, and this one I was pleased because this is full house today. Somebody getting presentations on the Trade Committee and investments of the APEC, because Papua New Guinea is the only Pacific country part of APEC, and we took a long time to get the APEC model together. We had a tremendous week of learning about APEC. All right.
I think people may not be familiar with the acronym APEC.
Asia Pacific Economic Community. It was the one that was just held in Peru, in Lima, and it was reported, say, in the BBC. It was just called an Asia Pacific Trade Meeting, as if it was a one-off. That's what the media do to these things. It's an ongoing dialogue of maybe 30 years standing. Now I'm hitting the button here, and at the moment, it's not responding. So, and it's not, it's sort of cool. So we'll go back, we'll go slideshow from current slide. Okay. There we go. Okay. I'll skip over this. This is the EGovernment project. It's all about connectivity. And unfortunately, because it's the remotest part of the world, with the smallest populations, it's the most expensive to bring internet. Every time internet reduces in price somewhere else in the world, it'll still be 10 times higher in the Pacific because of those economies of scale. And this is the type of technologies we use to bring people online, as you would do as well, so that we can have people in different parts of the Pacific, or even in Geneva, in the case at the top left there, at the ITU. So I'm hoping we can do more of that. Now, the city that I engage with a fair bit is Port Moresby. It's the largest urban centre in the Pacific Islands, and it has all the development aspirations that you could hope for. So just a few photos, and I've tried. That's the new city hall donated by the Chinese, and here I'm sitting with the main administrators of the city, and here we're literally sitting down to see whether we can start some dialogue, because this is a city that is in crisis every day. It's got urban crime, it's got challenges of corruption, it's got for example, the National Lands Department might, of its own accord, take some land that belongs to the province and just start doing something with it, and they have to then sort that out. It's on customary land, so they have to deal with the local landowners and ensure that the terms are constantly revised and in place. A lot of politics as well. So when it comes to just doing nice, clean policy processes, that's a luxury for them. And so we haven't been able to find the way to go forward with that. Now, this is up here because I work as closely as possible with the UN office in Port Moresby, and at the centre of that is Roy Trivedi. He's actually an Englishman, and he's the head of the UN office. And the UN office are happy to engage with us on this question of how do you dialogue with the government. And when I go back next year, I want to specifically, we're lining this up, what's different between MDGs and SDGs? What did you learn from that process? Are you doing anything better? Now, I gave this bit of, I'm not covering it today because I gave it in Stockholm, a bit of the dialogue where they're sort of trying to be more comprehensive and inclusive with the local government so that it's not just a UN program. All right, so that's just a little bit about the sort of projects that I've been involved in. And I will start skipping over some things that you can always ask what they were. This is small states in the world, and the dark green ones are the Pacific states, just to show that there's small. Now, just a little bit of sort of ethnographic information that the Pacific broadly has been identified as being 3 parts: Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia. Even that's a generalization, there are some aspects of it that have an impact on government, which is why I refer to it. Not because of the ethnic qualities of that. Polynesians are of a particular body, facial feature, etc. Melanesians are darker skin, and you know them immediately when you see a Melanesian as compared to that. And also Micronesians tend to be a little more Asian looking, but they're on the smallest of the countries. But the reason I mention it is that Polynesia has chiefly societies in which chieftainship was inherited. If you're a chiefly family, you are royal. And if not, you're a commoner. Now, this has a big impact in government, because chiefs don't have to prove anything. They're born into it. And so they might assume that they own a lot of the land, etc. If you're a commoner, even if you're at the top of a government agency, you can't go up to a chief. So you've got this crossover of your formal role and your traditional affiliation, and this causes all sorts of questions about influence and effects on village coordination, etc. Now, Melanesia, they have chiefs, but you earn it. Just because your father was a chief doesn't mean you're going to be a chief. You have to earn it. So it's a multi-industrious society, and that has an impact on government. So there's a lot more competition in government. People who want to be publicly involved. There's no chiefs and commoners in that sense, and it has a big impact on politics. Now, these people don't necessarily like each other because these people think that the Melanesians over here are chaotic, but I see them as far more democratic. So there's volatility here, but everybody's equal. Over here there's less volatility. It's because you're not equal and you can't speak. So you see, so that you might say, oh, there's a peaceful society. It doesn't mean they're happy with that. There's a lot of oppression going on under that peacefulness. Okay, so this has a big impact on government, and I won't go into more detail than that for now. Now, again, in a presentation, which Pacific do you want me to show you? Because they're both there. They both exist. And I could now give you the horror story of lamentable what's the condition of people and infrastructure. It's all there. Or I could show you it's pristine and beautiful and a paradise, because that's there as well. And sometimes they're right next to each other. So you might be familiar with this as well. Okay, so small states, but not just small states, small island states. And not just small island states, but small island developing states. So what it means is those 4 terms have a meaning in terms of government. So this is, for example, the Federated States of Micronesia. it's the part of the Caroline Islands in the Micronesian part, and these are small coral atolls. Now, an atoll means actually it's coral come up out of the sea on the top of volcanic tops and things. There's no soil. There's no agriculture. Maybe a very small amount, maybe coconuts and things, but it's fishing and then imported foods. Now, within that, there's a highlight here of one of my favourite states called Chuuk. And Chuuk never wanted to be part of this. So they have an independence movement in the middle here, the Chuukese. And so the other, maybe 20,000, 15,000, something like that. Yeah, Chuuk, yeah. Just a small group, but strong identity. And now, so the part of the islandness of this is that people over, say, in Khosrow, you might say, oh, they're all Pacific Islanders, or you might say, oh, they're all part of the Federated States of Micronesia. But these guys here will speak a totally different language to these people over here. Because this is the islandness of it. So you've got so many languages and cultures in the Pacific, and then they're told to be one country. This is a federation. And then, so within that, so you've got these identities.
What's the geographical east-west spread?
In terms of area? No, I don't have that. Sorry. There we are. Well, it's 2,000.
Yeah.
And that's one of the small ones. That's not as big as Kiribati.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So traditionally they did have transport. They did engage in trade, but they saw themselves as very different. And so in terms of modern states, it's not like people are joined by land who had enough identity issues. But these people develop different language, different cultures, different ways of doing things. So with the Papua New Guineans, to give it for example, when they come and traditionally they'll do a dance for, if they're invited somewhere, and they don't know which dance to do because they don't all do the same dance. And so you'll have somebody at the front who's an expert in that dance, and all the others are watching because they don't know that culture. It's foreign to them as well. So this is the challenges of making united peoples and governments. Okay, now this one, yes.
What's the basis for the federation in the first place?
Nothing. And I only say that because it's a long story.
Why is there a federation at all? Practical reasons?
No, it's a compromise. What happened was that this is the United States Trust Territory of the North Pacific Ocean, which came as a mandate of the United Nations. This is the jumping off area where the Japanese launched their attack on Pearl Harbor from these islands. And so at the end, when the United Nations was looking at what to do with the League of Nations trusteeships, they rolled them over into United Nations under Trusteeship Council. But in the North Pacific, there was one called a Strategic Trust, which is the US one. They put all the islands together under, so you could look up US Strategic Trust. Until 1962, nobody was allowed in or out. It was a strategic trust in which you had to get special permission to travel. And all those peoples just put together in the one area, and then when the process of decolonization, which was part of the UN system, all of these people had to decide who would work with who. And some said, like my favorite little country called Palau, which I've been talking to Stephanie about, didn't want to be with any of these people. Said, no, we're just not going to go with them. But these four compromised and said, okay, we'll make a federation. So it's just a compromise based on, these are artificial nation states. See, I talked to a young fellow, he says, I'm from the Federated States of Micronesia. What do you call me in? FSMA? Well, what's my country? So it's a compromise. They had traditional places, but the nation state is just carved out by colonial boundaries. And that's the story all over the Pacific. I've got a few paragraphs on that and other things. It's just colonial boundaries. There's only one or two Pacific countries that are sort of autochthonous, coming from pre-colonial times. That's Tonga and Samoa. And that's it. The rest are, amalgamations. Thanks for the question. Okay, so this is so getting to the physical side of things that just happens because it's these sort of tropical zones. This is where the cyclones have hit. Now you can map these things. So 1965 to 2016. Why am I putting this up? Because this has a huge impact on local government. Because people at ground level in cities, towns, settlements, and villages get impacted by these cyclones. You don't get, the Pacific gets hit every year. Doesn't mean your island gets hit every year. But when your island gets hit, you know it. Because your infrastructure is basically wiped out. And then, so this question of resilience under SDGs is really, it's not just a buzzword. Yeah, it's really, because 100 years ago, when you only had what's called native materials, they did it on purpose, because when it got blown away, you just put a hut up again. Now you put a bit of money into a school or a bridge, and they get knocked out and you've lost a bridge. So the question of infrastructure which is resilient that's why the World Bank's in there. They have specific agencies that are looking at, it's called the Pacific Regional Infrastructure Facility. Specifically, how do we build bridges and roads that will, it doesn't happen every year, but once in 10, 15 years, it will come and it will knock out your infrastructure. It doesn't happen to Sweden, you see. So, all right, so now this is trying to get through quickly, so this is sort of a map of sort of multi-level governance of the Pacific. You've got people live in cities, towns, villages, and settlements. That's where people live, and that's when you're a subnational level, local level. That's where the Pacific, 10 million people live there, and then they have the sovereign states. Here, and they have non-sovereign, which is sort of in association with a larger country. And then you have regional networks. So you've got the national systems there, then you've got regional networks, some official networks, some unofficial, and then you've got all the partners and all the global agencies. And they're all interested in policy, and they all want to make a difference on how you do things. So I put this up to emphasize that, by the time that people get their voice heard, these are the most expensive people to contact. It's easy to have global dialogue. It's easy even to have a regional dialogue. You just pull together, you get to all the regional representatives in the main city. But when you want to start to actually consult people, it gets expensive. Doesn't happen very often.
And time-consuming.
Time-consuming, expensive. Doesn't happen. So that's why this, in a national plan, it says the people's plan. I don't quite believe it. But because they put that in and say, yeah, you did this. This is for you. Yeah? It's all part of the... All right. So that's where people live. Took me a long time to learn that because I mixed with the people at the top. Yeah? All right. So now we'll get into a little bit of detail here, and this is just the orientation before we move into some practical examples. So this is the Pacific countries, Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia, you know that distinction now, and I'm going to highlight a few things. We don't have to look at the whole chart. Papua New Guinea is the biggest landmass. That's 462,000 square kilometres. It's a decent-sized piece of island. It has, this says 7 million. I think it's got more than that, but not that I counted them, but they've got a high population growth rate, etc. But so roughly 7 million. So the Papua New Guineans dominate the population of the Pacific. If there's 10 million in the Pacific, about 8 million of them come from this one country. That has an effect on regionalism. It also means there's more local government in that country than anywhere else. More need for it and more instances of it. Let's see what comes up next. Cook Islands. Now, I've done this because this is latest inter-census rural population declining. In some of the states, you've got people leaving the outer islands, the rural areas. So there's a couple there, and there's very low growth rates, and even in Fiji, there's no growth in the rural areas because of urbanization and overseas migration. Nauru has an urban population of 100%. Well, that's a special case. Urban population in Papua New Guinea is 13%. So you've got 8 million people, only 13% live in the urban areas. Yeah? More than 80% live in rural areas, experience government in rural circumstances, village level and settlements. So now, that has huge, when you see that, huge implications for communications. They're the rural people. They don't know what's going on in town. National politicians know that. They don't hear about all the scandals and things, that all the urban elite get frustrated about things. They don't know. So there's, in a sense, blissful ignorance there. So I've just pulled out a few things, and ironically it says capital city. Well, this is not correct. There's very little legislation about capitals. And they're not cities. In some cases, they're amalgamation of villages, and it's just simply that's where the colonial administration was, and it grew. So I would call it urban sprawl. There's no mentality of a capital city. It's urban sprawl where the main government offices are. And so they're trying to get a consciousness within the national governments about what, to look after your capital city. It's a special case. All right, I think that's about it. So I've highlighted a few. That's human development. There is growth in human development. But you actually see, this is the earliest years, 1990, and then it goes up in decades, 2000, 2010. That's sort of yearly updates there. Seems to be plateauing a bit there. Human development, they're mostly in the sort of, a couple in least developed status. But obviously there's no countries that are in the sort of developing country category. I won't go into more detail about that. Now I'm going to try just to cover a couple more of these dimensions, and then I'm going to give you some practical examples of the things we do. This has just come out, the emergence of Pacific urban villages. That's incorrect. Paul Jones is a nice guy, but this is not correct. Because he's taken the term village just because it's sort of unregulated, traditional grouping of people. It's not on their cultural land, and it doesn't necessarily have all the cultural arrangements of a village. But it is a grouping of people from a similar rural place coming into town. So it's more like a unique ethnic urban informal settlements. It's not a village. All right, so I'll put this paragraph in because he says estimated that roughly 1 million Pacific urban residents live in native and traditional villages and informal and squatter settlements, and that's likely to rise. Okay, the largest numbers of village-like settlements are in Melanesian Pacific capitals, Honiara, Port Moresby, Port Vila and Suva. So you've got these people who, they're no longer living under traditional authority in the village. They're not living in cities and towns because they can't afford it. They're not of the educated class. They're living in peri-urban areas. And one of the themes of the session is that, when you talk about squatters in sort of urban areas, you're talking about the sort of people who are neither in the modern space or in the traditional. It's somewhere in between, both in sort of law and culture and everything else. Okay, so that's a recent thing. Now, this is a few shots from Port Moresby, and just a few shots from different places. That's a traditional village. You see, I wouldn't call that. I mean, it's an urban village, but that's a traditional one. That's not a settlement. That is their land. They've lived there for generations. It's not a squatter settlement. They have customary rights there. No one can move them, etc. They live over the water for safety. They figured they could hear people coming and etc. So it's called Koki. I won't go into the detail of this. There are books on one of the studies we did years ago was to see to what extent rural and urban local spaces were recognised in law. And what we find is in some countries the laws will recognise customary practices and ownership and even authority, and others ignore them. So there's no uniformity across the Pacific. Solomon Islands, no recognition of customary authority. Vanuatu, they create a National Council of Chiefs. And I'll give an example later where they call the chiefs in for conflict resolution, etc. And not every one of the cities has a council act, you see. So you won't find one for Apia. They call it the capital of Samoa, but the national government's completely in control. There's no autonomy there at all. And yet they'll go to every local government meeting there is, you see. Sorry, I shouldn't record that, sorry. Okay, so what I've been trying to do is try to find out how many villages there are in the Pacific. This is only a few countries, not all of them. And you can see that Papua New Guinea's got thousands. But the interesting thing is that since colonial times, the colonial records were great. Every little village was marked in books, and they'd go around. But now nobody knows. But the other thing that's happened is in every country, my respondents say, what do you mean by village? We have hamlets. And others say, do you include ghost villages? And used to be there, but no longer there. And in Samoa, they said, do you mean official villages or unofficial? Registered with the government? So the concept of villages is, so we're still working on what it means. So the smaller countries, you know exactly what you've got. The larger countries, it's everywhere. Now, do they have rural authorities? Some countries just don't have them. Others have many, like Papua New Guinea is most advanced in this. They have local level rural authorities. And then they have urban authorities. And again, you see Papua New Guinea is the most important of the countries for local government because it has 31 urban authorities, something like 63 towns is sort of registered. They might just look like a couple of streets, but they're actually registered as towns. And also 3 cities. So they've got that. But the others don't really have cities. Fiji has 2 cities. PNG has cities. Solomon's the city of Honiara. But the rest, there's no cities sort of in law. And that has impacts on legal personality, rights to hold property, etc. Now, this is my theme of the importance of periurban populations. This is from a recent ADB report, and it's just the towns in selected municipalities in the country of Fiji, which is right in the middle of the Pacific. Now, the interesting thing is here, okay, small populations in the towns, fine, but look at the periurban population. So I'll just highlight a few. Nandi, 12,000 official residents, and a periurban population of 30,000. Right, and then I'll pick out another one here. So Singatoka, it's just a little town of 2,000 people. And it's got 8,000 people living just across the river. So they're living, what are they doing? They're not, they're living on customary land. They've built their own house. They've got some agreement with the customary owners, and they come into town to buy things. So the business community loves this because they get the business. The local government, the town looks dilapidated because there's so few ratepayers and there's so many users of the common facilities. All right, a few pictures. In Fiji, I used to travel around with the local government squatter units, and this is an example of, people they've found some land, it'll be customary land. They talk to the owner and say, can I bring my family here? And multiply that by families and whole villages, and they live like that. And that's what gets hit in the big cyclones. Now look in the background of those houses. You might think, oh, those houses are, well, actually they can still be squatting houses. Those squatters aren't necessarily poor. That's a presumption. It's a wrong presumption. They can be quite wealthy because they're not paying for their house and their land, and they can put up quite nice places. And because of the weakness of state, they're living quite well, paying no rates, didn't buy the land, just built the house. Okay, what have we got coming up here? Okay, that's a different city, customary village in Port Moresby. I put this up because this is the yacht club down here and some traditional things happening here and traditional village there, and then some sort of oil up there. It had a lot of things going on in the picture. They're all my photos.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
The former.
Yes.
Are there coming a lot of hurricanes in a city like this?
Not in this city.
No.
This is in somehow a protected belt. Port Moresby has not been hit. Yeah. Yeah. It's a very dry city. They shouldn't have put the capital there. It's got a harbour, but it's got no water. All right, well, this is just saying that local governments in the village, the settlement town, the city. Now, look, I'll get back to that one later. Now, the Pacific, in terms of progress that's being made, it has more development assistance per capita than any other part of the world. There's more development agencies in there doing things, putting in programs, etc. And, I could run into so many examples of over 30 years of these very specifically local government activities going on. UNDP, UN Habitat, the Pacific Urban Agenda, Cities Alliance, Asian Development Bank, etc. All of these. So there's a tremendous amount of development assistance in this environment. And here are some examples. This is Pacific Local Government Symposium. There's been a few of these. Bring together all the people who are heads of things involved in local government, and there are always tremendous events to go to. But this is the planning, the aspiration, the vision thing, and getting together with Asian Development Bank saying what can you offer, etc., and that sort of thing. And a lot of this is a global project that UN Habitat has called Rapid Urban Assessments. Just in a few days, they'll do a profiling of towns, and they'll come up with a series of recommendations. But the linkage between development assistance and implementation, UN Habitat can come up with recommendations that would be similar to what I put up on the slide: capacity building, refine your laws, clarify who's doing what. But implementation is still up to local government, to national government and local government authorities. So, all the recommendations are there. The knowledge is already known. It's often just the action that is missing. SDGs has to come into a stage of action on all the knowledge that's there. Papua New Guinea is the only country that has an urbanisation policy. So the 14 independent states, they come to all the meetings about urban, Pacific Urban Agenda, but only one country has organised an urbanisation policy with an office that does their own studies and comes out with plans, and that poor office has to then try and get traction with all the government agencies, land and employment and labour and industry and environment and just everything. Now, again, Papua New Guinea, because it's the biggest country, it's got the biggest intelligentsia, biggest capacity. This is a report of the Constitutional Law Reform Commission, 2009 review of the implementation of the organic law in provincial government and local level government. And this is an example of the sort of, it's scholarship. These guys are scholars, but they're working for the Law Reform Commission, and in detail of how services are not being delivered at local level. I could read you out the what's happening. It's quite concerning. It's also the only country that has specifically set out the different levels of responsibility between provincial government, local level government. I've just picked out one there, commerce and industry. But this took many years before they worked out who was responsible for what. And I became aware of this when I was doing some work on roads in PNG, and the question of who was responsible for roads, who was responsible for local roads, national roads, provincial roads, and all that sort of thing. So now, this is in the southern highlands of Papua New Guinea. I'll show you where it is. It's right in the middle there. It's called a place called Yalabu, Southern Highlands, one of my really favourite places to go. And this scene, when we're there, really got me thinking, because there's a sign. This is for the administrative centre for the area. And they've got themselves a nice building with fenced all around. And here you've got old women sitting in the sun with no shelters. There's no public toilets. There's no communications infrastructure. And I just thought it was, just questions about, okay, well, I presume that they're in that building planning for these people. But it really struck me this. And these people here are quite happy. They've done that for hundreds of years. Their parents did it, their grandparents did it. This is the local trading place. When it rains, there's mud and you get wet. When it's hot, you just put up some umbrellas. And to me, this is where the application of all the planning, etc., is to bring in some infrastructure at local level. I could show you many photos of going along the roads and showing how people live. This is in a village. We went in this place, and they're telling us about how they've got a health clinic, no supplies. They have a school, no teacher. They are 5 kilometres from the main road, and that's a rough track. And they are close to the junction. We thought, well, they're close to the junction. What about people who are further away? So these are the challenges, very real challenges. This is a Southern Highlands town called Mendi. Beautiful to stay up there. And this is the local government centre. Yeah, who holds the power in this town? There's the one towering building was the government building. And these government officials are frankly telling us about the political economy. I'm not going into today, but the way that the national politicians literally take the budgets that are for local level and do things with it. And they were venting their frustrations to us as we were travelling through. So there's a political economy side. Now we're back to Fiji and to luxury housing on the coast. And I'm going to tell you a little story now. This one will take 5 minutes to tell. So this is 2005. There's a regional agency called the Pacific Islands Forum contacted me and said, look, we've got money for security projects. What would you like to do? And I said, well, let's look at how people are living in the periurban areas, because that's where the least secure Pacific Islanders are. So we constructed, this is where the dialogue thing comes in, and linking to human security and local government. So I devised a program where I said to all the government bodies that dealt with squatters, said, can we come and talk to you and tell us what it's like to work with squatters? And so we went to a nice little retreat, and they told us how difficult it was to work with squatters, what a nuisance they are, and it upsets their programs. They're not ratepayers, and the local councils aren't interested, etc. And then we had these dialogues, and then we got just the squatters together. Not all of them, just some squatter leaders. And we said, what's it like to work with government? And they told us how hard it was to work with government. They don't listen to us. If you don't have a suitcase full of money, you can't even get in the door. We're having trouble getting electricity, water, etc., safety of our kids, etc. We're not criminals. We're all hardworking. They think we're criminals. We're not. We've all got jobs. We're, etc. So the whole point was that then we got them together. So that's a combined meeting. And so we said, okay, now talk to each other. and we gave a policy dialogue a thing, and a couple of these guys had in their mind to form a network. And so this is the meeting that they formed the network called the People's Community Network, PCN. And they were squatter leaders. And this is a photo that I took just this year with Masaki and with Father Kevin Barr. So you've got a Catholic priest who's devoted his life to the squatters, and a squatter leader who's again devoted his life to improving his people. So they used that dialogue process, they ran with it, they formed the legal entity of the PCN, they learned how to engage more effectively with government, and this is in Suva, and it's a place called Jitu Estate, and this is how people have been living. And these guys, over a couple of years, they studied all the problems of finance and tenure and materials and appropriate housing. They travelled to Philippines and Bangladesh and all sorts of things, and they've come up with this housing. It's not the physical buildings, it's the funding model. It's co-produced with the government. And people, see what happened, first of all, government would say to a squatter, they'd get a community, okay, we're going to relocate you and give you houses, and you've got title. And then somebody would come in and offer them money for the title, and they'd sell it for the money, and then they'd be landless and homeless again. So there's a model here is that you don't, it's leasing. You know, you sort of a long lease. You get a good house, you pay for it, government's paid for some of it. So this is the sort of creative sort of thing that can happen. But that's only one example. Now here's another one. This is a new model village. It's called Peter Karoi. It's using modern materials. It's all about sustainability. They have committees running the village, etc. It's not a traditional village. It's a new village. So there are these types of initiatives as well. I won't go into those details.
I have a simple question.
Oh yes, please.
About the energy, what kind of energy do they use to deliver their electricity?
Yeah, well, at the moment they're still on. They're probably on diesel here, but they're going solar. So they have a very strong creed of going fully sustainable. But the problem with solar up until now has been the cost of panels. So I've been to islands where they've just put in new diesel. I say, why'd you do that? They say, well, it was cheaper for us to put in a diesel plant than to get the solar panels. That's changed. So that once the solar panels are cheap, you can imagine that they can put them on all the houses. So they've got the aspiration. They know their problems. They know what the solutions are. Often funding is the in-between thing. So thanks for that. But this is, they recycle and they do their vegetables, etc. It's a model village, and a lot of people go to look at it. So let me just go quickly now because I think I'm starting to overstay my welcome here. Sustainable development goals, many of them, it was the idea that they're irreducible. You couldn't, some countries said it's all or none, so there's 17, and this was not in the MDGs. In this expressed way of sustainable cities and communities with a whole raft of goals, targets here, and the question now is how you measure these. So this is a complex list here of ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services and upgrade slums. That enough will take 15 years before you look at the others, based on the trajectory of what I've seen in the last 30 years. Provide access to safe, affordable, accessible, sustainable transport systems, improve road safety, etc. That is a huge question for these small states, how they're going to do it. Enhance inclusive and sustainable urbanisation and capacity for participatory, integrated, sustainable human settlement planning. All these aspirations are there. The question is capacity and will. There's specific links here to peri-urban areas, etc. So everything's covered there is highly relevant to the Pacific circumstances. And the last one, of course, with financial and technical assistance, finding those levels of support. Now, this has just come up last week as I'm preparing for today. This is Vanuatu Daily Digest, another little Melanesian country, about 180,000 people. Port Vila is the little municipal city with squatter settlements here. Port Vila Municipal Council advocates for town planning, but is this possible without a town planner? There's very few town planners in the whole Pacific, so they know the issue, but they don't have the capacity there. So government can talk about it, but unless they can plan it, etc. Now this one, the Vaturisu Council of Chiefs wants the issue of squatter settlements resolved on Ifate. Now, the reason this is here is that the national government says, okay, you don't have title to that land, we want you off it, you've got to leave by whatever date, and then if they haven't left, they bring in the bulldozers. So there's a number of countries, Papua New Guinea is another, they just bulldoze and just clear it. And so when you look at the difference between that practice and the aspiration of the SDGs to have planning processes and dialogue and upgrade slums, etc., there's a huge transformation that's going to be needed in the mentality of the planners and decision makers who decided to send the bulldozer in, and what were the choices. So there's my conclusions again, and they're not new. And I think you'd say, oh, we know all these. There's nothing new about them. It's just the Pacific circumstance. But what that does show is that there are commonalities of challenge, even in these unique places. There might be some things unique. The islandness is unique. You want to do energy on a shared land platform. You want to do energy. You can just put power lines. You want to do transport. Just do bus route. But here with the islands, you can't do that. You can't put buses in. And if you have boats, you need docks. You need jetties, etc. So all these things happen. You want to check your schools. There's just a school inspection. Okay, well, we put somebody in a car and we drive around the schools. But here you can't do that. You've got to fly people, put them on boats. They'll be out for weeks. So every little thing is harder in islands. That's one of the things that I've identified as a point of difference from other small states, developing states. Yes, please.
Yes, can you see some things the other way around, that there are some good things about that they are living in islands and do things maybe in a different way than we do in the Western world?
Yeah, well, I've been looking for them. And so I think 150 years ago there was this idyllic life where they had traditional lifestyles, and it was just a tremendous place to live, and their cultures were rich, and they had full lives. But once you monetize those societies and they need money to buy something, you can't have then the traditional lifestyle of just fish, go out and fish and come back. So what's happened is that the idea that they're happy and doing well is an idyllic idea that is not any longer. The only people who are happy are people who've got a bit of money and security. I have met happy people on islands, but they're happy if they're healthy. This is what I've learned. If you get sick on an outer island, you die. In an island called Bougainville, the premier, he's the most powerful man on the island, he lost his 28-year-old daughter about 3 years ago to asthma. And it shouldn't happen. And he was the man who most likely to be able to get help for her, and it didn't happen. So the formula I say is, if you're healthy in the islands, great. Once you break a leg, once you've got a kidney problem, you've got any signs of cancer, you're dead. And so things have changed. So health is now, and cancer, early detection, etc. Dialysis, kidney things. They've got lifestyle disease problems, etc. So what they're hanging on to is culture. With what's unique is our culture. But the younger generation are moving from that as well. And they're happy with some sort of modified culture as well. So there's a lot of rapid change going on in these places. But is there much contentment? Only pockets, I'd say.
I'm sorry, what do you mean? Are there no hospitals there?
You look at the quality of the health indicators. Yes, there are hospitals in the major centres. But what I'm saying, if you're on an outer island and you get sick, if you can't afford the fare in, and the government can't afford the fare in, so you get a lot of appeals. People say, oh, little Johnny has got this disease, we need to do a fundraiser to get him off the island, etc. Happens all the time. So because you don't have the medical care spread across the islands. And then when you come into the centre, you get the quality of medical care that is they're capable of doing in those small states. It's not as good as elsewhere. No social security, none. They used to call the village the traditional social security net. But what happens now, people used to say, oh, when I retire, I'll go back to the village. But now they go back after 30 years in the town. People say, we don't know you. What did you do for the village the last 30 years? And so people are losing their place in the village. And so they don't feel welcome back there. And they have these huge dilemmas as how much to be urban, how much to be village. All these dilemmas. And I had to think this through because I want to say Pacific, positive view of the culture, etc. But there's a lot of tensions within the minds of people about whether the culture liberates them or oppresses them, and which way to go forward, retaining some things, but becoming a different people in a global era. So, yeah.
How about the concept of sharing economy? That's gaining wind here in sort of the developed world. Gothenburg handing out a prize to the mayor of Seoul just the other week. Is sharing economy a concept who could profit in these areas, or is it just a dead end?
Well, that was the tradition, because they were communitarian, but that sharing ended with your kin group. So you know, I've had to think through this idea of ethics as well. They don't have universal ethics. It's situated ethics, where the right thing to do is to help my people. But the moment I'm helping someone else, my people see it as the wrong thing, and I'll get into trouble. So when you've got a national government that has to share things across all the regions, it's a big test for some people. So they're still learning what a national ethic is. Now, the question of sharing resources or goods is still a challenge. Yep, I'd say it's still a challenge, even though you've got the theory of, we all share things. But that's why people are leaving the village, because they're sick of sharing. They can't accumulate anything for the family. And they want to, and I'm telling you this because I know from my personal experience of friends. They say, you know, I've been working, you know, for so many years, and all my cousins just come. I'm sorry, this is on, but I was in Suva 2 weeks ago. This is a silly one. And I bought a family some pizza. And I think they must have texted their cousins, because by the time I got home, there was 15 people in the room. And I know that, but that's what, you know, it's a sharing of it. See, so they don't want to, they know what it's like. And that's a burden if they have to constantly share like that. And that's a trivial example, but the idea that sharing is a tradition, but in a monetized society, it's a burden, because you completely, you give out all the time. There are terms for this sort of thing. You know,
And
you can
have a job and a decent income.
Yeah.
You're it.
Yeah, and you rise in stature, but you're materially poor, and you can't put your own kids through college. You can't send them out. If you're a senior government person, you've got aspirations for your kids to go to good university overseas. You'll never be able to afford it, because it's all going out to the village. And so there are problems there. So maybe in the future, if you get a Pacific Islander to come in and talk in detail about these cultural dynamics and how they affect government, would be a great thing.
There are theories saying that it's easier to maintain responsive governments in small states, especially close to island states, because there are fewer layers of government, and it's easier for the citizens to hold their politicians accountable and mobilize against them if they don't hold responsibility.
Who says that?
There are a few theories,
Right.
sort of out there, and
Right.
I wonder, like, if you noticed during your fieldwork, what are the reasons for it not working in smaller states in the Pacific? If there are, I understand that each island probably has their own story, but if there are trends.
Yeah, you see, there's two things. There's small community, but there's also power distance. You see, there's the two things. So societies have a way of working out on the basis of smallness and power relations. So if you're in a community where there's a high power distance between those who are in charge and those who are at the bottom, then there's not much accountability. So in Fiji, this is the case. Small society, but the chiefs, once they say something, that's it. And you may be the most educated people, but so it causes a dilemma there. Now there are examples like Tuvalu is a country which is they have island councils, and people on those islands might be just 2,000 to 6,000 people, and there is much more accountability at the island level there. So there are examples you can think of, but I can give you many specific examples of local councils that do not listen to the local people, provincial councils that do not listen at the provincial level. So that theory, it really has something also in there about that power distance and the impunity that people who are protected by law. Now, they're not protected traditionally. And I could almost say that some of the traditional models of governance were more effective. If you didn't do your job as a traditional leader, you'd be out. But once you're a member of parliament, no one can get rid of you. And so there's a problem here so people who get into the modern power structures, they start to realize this, they do all sorts of things. the people know about the indiscretions. We've got judges who have taken money recently, and because they knew the law well enough, they got out of the. It was front page that they'd taken this bribe. It was everywhere. Oh, this judge surely is going to get in trouble. The case was thrown out because of the legal technicalities of how it was filed, etc.
Sounds
So,
familiar.
yeah, well, is that? Well, it's this impunity under the modern law.
Yeah.
But under local, under traditional conditions, you know, you could dispatch your leader. And you know, even in Tonga, the powerful kings, if they didn't do the right thing for you, you know, they'd be done in like a king of England would be done in.
Yeah.
Oh, good questions. Okay.
I think we should, at this point, move next door and continue talking informally, seeing we're a small group, over food. But let's just take this opportunity to thank Graham for a fascinating,
Thank you.
carefully nuanced presentation that covers the macro to the micro and all the gory detail of the micro as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
all.
much
Thank you.
indeed.
Thank you.